Hello, I'm Becky Cross. Welcome to this 10 minutes on tenant migration webcast focused on domain moves. In this short webcast, we're going to cover how to prepare for a domain move, discuss some options for handling mail flow during the move, and take a look at the steps that occur during a domain move from start to finish. Moving a domain from one tenant to another is usually one of the final tasks that you will perform after all other workload migrations are complete and users are no longer accessing the source tenant. A domain move is a complex task and can have serious impacts on your users and your applications if you do not properly plan for it. So let's talk about some of the pre-checks and decisions that you should consider when preparing for your domain moves. First, review each of the domains in the source tenant that you plan to move to the target and identify whether there are any parent and child relationships, whether domains are managed or federated, and note which domain is currently set as the default domain in your tenant. Based on the results of these checks, you may need to add tasks to your project plan. For instance, if there are parent-child relationships, you will want to move the child domains first and then the parent domain afterwards. If any of the domains are federated, you will need to convert them to managed domains prior to performing their domain move. Also ensure that the domain being moved is not currently set as the default domain in the source tenant. Next, take a look at whether the domain is still being used by various workloads. Check whether there are applications and SMTP servers that might reference the domain, and document any directory syncs between the source environment and other environments, other than the standard Azure AD Connect sync that you might have. Again, schedule some tasks, which could include remaining migrations, make your plans to update any applications and servers that reference the domain, either before the domain move or in conjunction with the domain move event. And if there are directory syncs providing coexistence with other environments, you might need to update those sync settings or even plan to completely disable the syncs. As you review all of the source objects that have the domain in their attributes, check the UPN as well as mail-related attributes and document whether the objects are synced from Active Directory or are cloud only. For all source objects that have a related object in the target environment, make sure to generate a mapping file that you can use to copy the source attributes to the target objects. It is important to know if the domain is used as a UPN in the source environment, since the source UPN will have to change as part of the domain move, and it could impact user access. And knowing the sync status will help you understand where the source changes will need to be performed. There are also some key decisions to make as you prepare for this domain move. You will need to choose a replacement domain that can be assigned to the source objects. For instance, when you change a UPN, you can't just remove the domain suffix. You have to choose a new suffix. Also review your Azure AD Connect configuration and decide whether to leave it as is for the domain move, whether to remove the source Azure AD Connect and formally convert the source tenant to cloud only, or whether to switch the source AD to sync directly to the target tenant. And note whether the source accounts will still be used after the domain move to access any resources. When you've chosen your replacement domain, run a check against your environment to identify if these changes will cause any UPN or proxy address conflicts with other objects that might already have those values. And depending on your decision for your Azure AD Connect configuration, coordinate any required changes. The easiest and most common choice is to leave the config as is and let the domain move changes sync up from AD to Azure. If you do decide to convert the source to cloud only, or to have your source AD sync directly to your target tenant, this will require greater planning due to the complexity of those changes. And if the local source accounts will still be used after the domain move, schedule a task to reset those UPNs back to what they were after the domain move is complete. Determine whether the migrated users will continue using their new UPN in the target or whether they will switch back to their original source UPN after the domain is moved. Also determine whether you want to add the email addresses just as secondary aliases on the target accounts, or whether you will switch the users back to having them as their primary address. There will also be a decision to make regarding mail routing, which we will review in depth in a few minutes. Again, as you make these decisions, ensure you are adding the required tasks to your project plan for updating UPNs, updating mapping files, and planning your mail routing. And note that some of the domain move tasks will require elevated access in the tenants and will require updates to DNS and possibly third-party mail services. Determine who will be responsible for making these changes and ensure that they are available during the domain move event. Let's dive more into how mail flow can be impacted during a domain move event and discuss some of your options available to alleviate those impacts. During standard operations, your MX record for the domain might point directly to M365, or it might point to a different mail service that eventually routes the messages to your tenant. Either way, a message sent to that domain will be received by the tenant that currently owns the domain and will then be successfully delivered if a valid recipient is found. However, during a domain move, there will be a period of time where the email addresses will have been removed from all of the source users, but the domain itself has not yet been removed from the tenant. If you leave your mail routing as is, when the message reaches that source tenant, no valid object will be found and the sender will receive a non-deliverable report. Even once you get the domain moved to the target tenant, there will be a period of time where the target addresses are still being applied to objects and replicating throughout Exchange Online, and you will see the same behavior of the target responding with NDRs. Fortunately, there are a few options available to prevent these NDRs from being issued. If your MX record points to a third-party mail service, such as Proofpoint or Mimecast, which then routes to M365, you might have the option to configure that service to hold incoming messages during the domain move. By updating that third-party service to hold the messages in a queue, this will ensure that the messages do not attempt to route to M365 during the actual domain move event. Message delivery will be delayed, but senders will not receive NDRs. Once you have finished adding the domain to the target tenant and to the target objects, you could then restore the original mail routing in your third-party service and instruct it to release all of the held messages. The queued messages will then be successfully delivered to the target mailboxes at this time. A second option available is to update your MX records or third-party service to point to a non-routable domain, which will behave similar to a formal queuing process. By routing to a domain that cannot be resolved, the messages will be automatically retried intermittently over the next few days, again instead of generating NDRs. And some third-party services can even be configured to allow retries for a longer period if needed. Again, once the domain has been successfully added to the target tenant and objects, you can restore your original mail routing to M365. At this point, the messages will be successfully delivered to the target mailboxes on the next automated retry. A third option is to utilize a mail relay. If you are using a third-party domain move product, it may come with a mail relay built in, or you can research other mail relay solutions if you are performing your domain moves manually. With this approach, you update your MX records or third-party service to point to the designated mail relay, which will utilize a mapping file that matches your source objects to your target objects. When a message is received by the mail relay for a known source address, it references that mapping file and then delivers the message immediately to the matched target mailbox. Using a mail relay achieves our goal of preventing NDRs while also ensuring no delays in message delivery. Once you have confirmed that the domain has been successfully added to the target tenant and objects, then you can restore the original mail routing and disable the mail relay. Since messages sent during the domain move would have already been delivered real time, there are no queues or retries to be processed. We've talked about many decisions that will help you prepare for a successful domain move. Now let's review the steps that will take place during the domain move event itself. The first step is to ensure that you finalize your preparation tasks, including completing your content migrations and creating your mapping file. Make sure you have identified all aliases that need to move, not just the primary SMTP. If you are using a third-party tool for your migrations, these mappings will likely be automatically generated. Once you are ready to start the domain move, remember to update your mail routing to ensure that senders will not receive NDRs during the event. Now you're ready to start clearing the domain from the source objects. For objects that are synced from AD, you will need to update the objects in AD and then have those changes sync up to Azure. You can update the cloud-only objects directly in Azure. This step is where you will remove the domain from UPNs and from mail attributes, updating those entries with your designated replacement domain. This removal can be performed by a migration tool or with scripts. And for cloud-only environments, you can also make some bulk changes directly in your tenant, such as updating UPN suffixes. Once the domain has been removed from the source objects, you will be able to remove the domain itself from the source tenant and then add it to the target tenant. Remember that these actions require elevated tenant access, whether it's using a service account in a migration tool or whether it's being performed manually by a tenant admin. And once the domain is added to the target tenant, you will need to follow a few steps to finish domain verification, including updating DNS. Once the domain is verified in the target tenant, you will want to ensure that the aliases are added to all of the matched objects and appear correctly in the Target Exchange Online environment. Remember that if the objects are synced from Active Directory, you will need to update the attributes locally and let those changes sync to Azure, whereas you can update cloud-only objects directly. And depending on the decisions you made earlier, you might choose to update the target UPN and all mail attributes, including primary SMTP, or you might choose to only add these secondary email aliases to the target accounts. Again, many of these tasks can be performed by a migration tool or can be completed using scripts. Once you confirm that everything looks correct in the target tenant, you can finally restore your mail routing and perform final validations. And don't forget to take care of any extra tasks that you might have identified earlier, such as resetting source UPNs or updating application configs. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about domain moves. If you are interested in trying Quest on-demand migration, download the free 30-day trial. And if you have found this helpful, watch our other 10 minutes on tenant migration webcasts.